Hello everybody! This is both Jade and the second episode of Skimming over Pale. I have a few announcements this week. I try not to have announcements in general, but sometimes you gotta have them. So Pale Reflections exists. They go in a chronological order through the whole of Pale and analyze what happens in every chapter. I'm not going to try to retread ground that they are covering, and I'm just going to go in a completely random order from here on out with no logic as to how frequently or what I'm covering from week to week. Next week, I will be completely caught up, though, so all episodes from here on out will be from 1 to wherever the current chapter is. And next week's episode will be an analysis of Avery. Since I didn't get to everything that I wanted to talk about Avery last week at all, in fact, I barely scratched the surface of the things I wanted to say. But on average, I'm going to go for one episode an arc, but I'm not going to be going over, like, the plot, really, unless it's an episode about the plot. Second of all, on the topic of Pale Reflections, I was on an episode last week, which, if you are interested enough in Pale to watch this video, you probably know, but in case you didn't, at the end of each arc, Pale Reflections invites a guest on to speak about what happened in the arc, and I was the guest for bonus episode 2, the episode covering the arc Stolen Away. So I will post a link in the description below. I thought it was a pretty good episode, even though my audio sounds atrocious. And I'm not sure why. Finally, this episode is really, really late. In fact, it's a whole week late, and I'm sorry about that. These episodes have been getting later and later because it was approaching the end of the semester, but now the semester is over, so I should be back to regularly scheduled episodes from here on out. So this week's episode, I'm going to be going over the major players in the magical side of Kennet and what we know about them and what they've been doing, how they've been contributing. So I went back and reread the prologue after reading up to 3.2, which is the most recent that I've read at this point, and just wanted to reread it from the perspective of someone who has read the next two arcs. I'm not going to be talking about 3.1 and 3.2 right now, but I wanted to look at what we find out in the prologue through the eyes of actually knowing these people now, or knowing them to an extent. So the prologue follows Louise, who is this woman who lives alone in the mountains, and at first we're thinking that she's a very old lady, but she actually isn't. She's a 35-year-old woman dying of diabetes and a bunch of other health problems that seem to stem from her not really taking care of herself. She seems to have largely accepted the fact that she's going to die at some point soon. Later on, Matthew asks her if she's dying, and she's surprised to admit it to herself. But as far as her attitude goes, she's not really looking forward to anything about the future. Or thinking about the future in any way. She has a very bleak outlook about her own life. And at the start of the prologue, she has gotten close enough to death that she has gained the ability to see magic, or she thinks it's hallucinations, because her medication is supposed to cause hallucinations, so she's been on the lookout for it. The chapter opens up with a howl that shakes her house, and she begins crying blood. Throughout the chapter, she feels this sympathetic sadness, and when I say sympathetic, I mean the sadness seems to be coming from outside of herself, like the emotions are being beamed into her, and she doesn't know where it's coming from, but she does see a large red dog, like a really, really large red dog, to the point that when she's driving in her car, the legs of the creature go up into the clouds, and she realizes that this creature is injured. She follows it to a hockey rink, and where she sees that it dies. The whole chapter is about this feeling that this ancient and powerful creature is coming to an end. But the other thing that permeates this chapter is the introduction of the setting, Kennet. Ontario, the small town mentioned previously. Louise drives quite a bit to be able to get to civilization, but when she does, she's helped across the street by an old classmate, Lincoln. And I doubt we'll ever see Lincoln again, but it establishes this feeling of a small town where everybody knows everybody. Louise says that she doesn't know the children who are hanging out at the gas station, but she is pretty sure that she knows which families most of them belong to, because it's just that kind of town. But there's also this expectation that helping the people you know is a given. Lincoln helps her. She asks her 2 neighbors to help her later and promises to pay them back. There's a feeling of community, and it's not an extremely happy small town, but it's not bleak. So after seeing that the Carmine Beast, which we later find it's called the Carmine Beast, has died, she comes across 3 people and a bunch of children talking about the situation. And at first she overhears them speaking, and then they see her and ask her to come over and talk to them. And we find out later that the 3 people whom she sees are Matthew, Edith, and Miss. And the children are the Hungry Choir. Matthew, Edith, and Miss are talking to each other about, did you get here already? And do you know what's going on? And they all seem to be trying to portray to each other that they don't know what's going on at this point. And in the world of Pact and Pale, no one can lie, particularly not magical creatures like these 3. But it's possible that one or all of them are trying to deceive each other here with half-truths in their words. However, based on what I saw, going back and reading this again, if one or more of the 3 of them are responsible for the death of the Carmine Beast, I don't think they were working together, or something is preventing them from knowing that they were working together, because they try to make the other believe, or just do make the other believe that they weren't involved, they just got here, what are we going to do about this? Importantly, however, the Hungry Choir cannot communicate, and we don't know when they got there. Matthew erases Louise's memory in exchange for taking away a significant part of her illness, under the agreement that if someone asks her to recall the events of tonight, she will be able to, as in her memory will return, and promises her that someone will come by to ask her about what she saw at a later time. Then Louise wakes up back in her house and goes on about her day, not realizing that anything is different other than the fact that she feels much better and maybe isn't going to die very soon. So with all that in mind, I want to talk about the Carmine Beast a little bit. There are these 4 creatures that rule over this area of Canada, although it's a very lax definition of rule. It seems like they influence things passively and can arbitrate in the case of disputes between people. But if one of the 4 roles is vacated, such as with one of them dying, that role is replaced. So the Carmine Beast is a creature who is taking the role of the Carmine, whatever, one of the 4 seats. And now that she's dead, someone else will have to take her place, who will be in charge of that part of these 4 creatures. She seems to have some kind of tie to violence and violent urges, and her absence makes the girls see lots of violent imagery everywhere. But the actual influence over the events of the town are largely unknown at this point, because we haven't seen what these people act like with the Carmine Beast here, or with this position filled. But the thing about the Carmine Beast is that at one point she was a person, or rather an other like everyone else in town. The two people who are being considered to fill her place, people, are John and the Hungry Choir. Both sentient beings that we know and are getting to know fairly well who will be placed in this position. So the Carmine Beast was at one point like John or like the choir. But nobody seems to care about who she was or her at all. Presumably all the people that she knew before she took on this position are gone. Because other than that, I can't think of an explanation as to why they care so little about this being that died beyond the logistics of having somebody big and important die in the middle of your town. So I pulled out this quote from the prologue. It says, "The great beast was gone, and she felt lost, like a child that had seen her birthday come and go with nobody remembering. She didn't know why, and she couldn't put it together in her head with the visions of blood." Specifically the part that says, "a child that had seen her birthday come and go with nobody remembering." It's not a dead ringer for the situation with the Carmine Beast, but it is reminiscent. She died, and it's an inconvenience for everybody in town. They have to go find new practitioners to investigate the situation. They have to field other practitioners away from the town and, basically do the equivalent of one step above paperwork because this thing happened. It's kind of heartless. She apparently passively influenced the entire area, and nobody is talking about whether she was a good person or an asshole or whatever. And Lucy has actually asked this a couple of times, but hasn't really gotten anywhere with it. Like, almost to a strange degree. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I want to talk about the others of Kennet. When I was first reading The Awakening Ritual in 1.1 and 1.2, I commented that it felt like a barbecue. So you've got all these magical creatures, like a ton of them, all together living in this town, and they treat each other as like colleagues or acquaintances. Not just a barbecue, I said a work barbecue, where some people, you laugh, but they're not your bestie. You might bring your spouse along, but they don't really know everybody else. That kind of thing. So there's all of the humans of the town, and then a group of these others, like a large group of them, and they don't have any human practitioners who are aware of their existence other than Charles, who is kind of an exception. And it immediately makes you wonder why. I was wondering if they had kept humans from learning about magic on purpose or from entering the town because they were trying to be defensive. They were trying to keep humans away. And I do think that is what we're seeing as the story goes forward. Miss, in particular, is almost paranoid about people coming in and trying to gain control over the others who live in this town. John and Guillerme, for example, as well as Blunt Munch, are kind of responsible for making sure that other practitioners don't come into the town and don't have the opportunity to see what actually is in Kennet. At the end of Arc 2, we see that Alexander Belanger is really, really interested in what's going on in Kennet, but doesn't actually seem to know what is there. The question is whether they are trying to hide something specific, or if they are just trying to create their own little commune, which is a term that I've heard people use for this. But they haven't explicitly explained what their intention is. So I'm wondering if there's more to it. So first, I want to talk about Charles. Charles is the practitioner who used to be the practitioner of Kennet, but then he became Forsworn, which means that at some point in his life he made an oath, and he broke that oath on accident, and now he's basically screwed over by the entire planet. He has the worst luck in anything that he does, but I kind of think of forswearing as having an extremely negative charisma score, or rather, I think of karma as being your charisma score in D&D. If you have a good charisma score, people generally passively assume the best of you. But if you have a bad charisma score, they don't. Charles, the girls never listen to anything that he says. Every time one of them looks at him, they're like, this dude's really creepy. I don't want to listen to anything he says. He's probably wrong. They get offended by the things that he says. He screws up in speech pretty frequently in ways that make what he's saying seem a whole lot worse than he probably intended. And he serves as a cautionary tale, because at the very beginning of the story, he tells the girls, hey, I don't think you should have taken the awakening ritual. I don't think that you should have gotten involved in magic. And they go, all right, thanks. And they just don't listen to him. Because they don't, for one, magic is cool. For two, they're not inclined to listen to anything that Charles says because of this. But to the reader, it's supposed to show us that a single mistake, even for someone who had been practicing for decades like Charles, ruined his entire life. We find out at some point that the illness that Matthew took from Louise went to Charles. Because that's just how forswearing works. I mean, they did it on purpose, but he's supposed to be punished. And the interesting thing is, and people on Pale Reflections have actually commented on this, but when Charles was forsworn, it was because he got into an argument with Alexander Belanger about prison reform and about whether you should continue to punish someone for the rest of their life for crimes that may not be proportionate to that punishment. And at some point when they were very young, he had promised to Alexander that he would never cause him harm. And basically, Alexander stepped on a piece of glass in his house, and that was how he became forsworn. Stepped on a piece of glass after Charles shoved a table at him or something. But he did accidentally cause Alexander to have something to call him forsworn about. But when you hear this story, it's clear that forswearing wasn't really a mistake he made. It was a mistake that he made, but it was something that happened to him. It was largely out of his control. Like an accident that, like a bad car accident that technically, yes, if you had taken a different turn, you could have avoided it, but blaming the person is almost moot, or is moot. But overall, Charles is one of the only legitimate resources that the girls have for learning magic other than Matthew. And the fact that they are predisposed to discount his advice out of hand is a disadvantage. And I think as the girls move forward, they will understand that they are being influenced by karma. But they lost a bit of a head start at the beginning by not listening to Charles. Or they probably lost the biggest head start by not having the opportunity to talk to Charles in the first place. But this idea of permanent punishment is something that is being explored very, very explicitly with Charles, but also with a few other characters, such as the Hungry Choir, who we'll get to later. So then there's Miss. Miss is the leader and the face of the town, which is funny because you can't see her face or her hands. She has something funky going on up in there where everywhere she walks, there's like a branch in the way of somebody being able to see her. So, and this goes to absurd lengths, and I always think it's a little bit funny when somebody really tries to see her face and then have a sudden urge to look down or whatever. Maybe it's not that funny. I think, yeah, okay. And as the leader, her attitudes are most reflected in the rest of the community and in the way we see them. So she seems to actually care very deeply for the girls. The advice that she's given them has been sound. But she's also kind of paranoid and defensive. She talks a lot about, I don't want other practitioners coming in here. I don't want anyone being able to bind us. And those are the values that the rest of the town seems to live on. She's intelligent and she has sound judgment. But her judgments basically are the judgments of the town because no one else is stepping up to be leader. I have seen some speculation that because she has no role, she may be trying to become the next Carmine Beast. Maybe? I mentioned this on Pale Reflections, but I think that Miss is going to end up being the person most responsible for the death of the Carmine Beast because Lucy thinks she did it. Or Lucy thinks she's very suspicious. Most of her lines... okay, not most. A lot of her lines come at, the end of a chapter. Everything about her is just portrayed more dramatically in the text. She has a lot of story weight. And if she didn't kill the Carmine Beast, I think she's either going to replace the Carmine Beast or have an equally important role in the end of the story. Yeah, so she speaks frequently about threats and how she can't be around if something big is happening, but she always places herself in the middle of important situations. Which, I understand. I'm nosy. She does appear to have a few extra senses, which is interesting. And then in 2.8, we find out that she is lost, with a capital L. See, my favorite, also least favorite quality about Miss is that she's ridiculously vague. Every time she speaks, she communicates the bare minimum amount of information, except in very, very specific situations. And here's an example. So, Avery asks her if she's lost, and she says yes. She says, "I was by the wayside, a memory without anyone to have it, or a person forgotten even by the abyss, or an echo forgotten even by the ruins. I waited by a place called the Stairwell Web. Someone made a wrong turn, they panicked, they ran, and for a moment neither of their feet touched the stair. I put my foot down before they did. I took their place, they took mine. I walked the various paths for a long time before I made my way to this world. I was trapped for a long time in the yellow flower spiral, and I walked the forest ribbon trail by instinct alone." See, this is a whole paragraph about who Miss is, and I read it over and over, and I gleaned no information from it, other than the fact that she came from, at one point she was on the forest ribbon trail, which is important. But all of this means ridiculously little because, for example, she took someone else's place in the world, but the phrasing doesn't suggest whether she had any agency about it. It doesn't say if she's trying to do anything. All it said, it's very poetic and pretty. And it just says, yes, she was lost. Just like her meaning in almost everything she says. Oh yeah, I forgot to say, in the prologue, she did arrive before Matthew and Edith, but not long enough to have seen anything, she says. But she said it in a vague way. Finally, the simple fact that we can't see her face or hands implies that there is something to be seen about it. And maybe there isn't, but this is why there's constant speculation that she is, Verona from the future, time shifted into the past, or whatever, which was a serious theory that I had until I listened to the episode of Pale Reflections where they also had that theory. And I don't know, for some reason, hearing that somebody else had the theory totally killed it in my mind. Anyway, but her nature invites constant speculation. And of course, while she is the leader and she seems to care about the girls, for sure, she doesn't really seem to care about the rest of the town's denizens. She doesn't really care if John dies taking the Carmine Beast throne place. Whatever. Don't go talk to the fairies. They suck, or whatever. Yeah. But I like her, though. I really like her. So she took somebody else's place in the world, and that brings us to our next people. Okay. They're always around each other, so I'm counting them as 1 and 3. Matthew and Edith. So personally, if, like, this is how much I care about the rest of everything that's going on, whenever Matthew and Edith are on screen, I care like this much about trying to figure out what's up with them. Because they have a large collection of qualities that make me really, really, really interested in them. So Matthew and Edith are a married couple who live in Kennet, and he used to be a practitioner of a specific type called a Heartless, who was able to deal with life force and stuff, but he doesn't really do that anymore. He came across this complex spirit called the Girl by Candlelight, made up of a bunch of ghosts and echoes of other people that started to congeal together into a whole person. And he talked to her for a while, and then eventually they found a way to put the Girl by Candlelight into the body of Edith James, a woman who was in a coma because she attempted to commit suicide. She learned how to control Edith's body. She visits Edith's family to make what's left of the original Edith happy and satisfy her, but she's taken over this woman's life, and it seems like the original Edith is okay with this. And then Matthew and Edith got married, and now they are a couple. Also, so there's obviously a lot of baggage that comes with being a ghost. There's good bits and there's pain. There's the memory of dying. And so all the good bits became Edith, and all the bad bits congealed into this large mass of darkness and doom, which Matthew took on as his power source, creature that lives inside him, as the Hulk. I don't know, we haven't seen him really, really use this yet. But I really, really want to know more about it. Between the two of them, they share all the components of all of these ghosts. Her, the personality and the good bits, and him, the pain and the dying parts. And it seems like Matthew is actually probably one of the more powerful people / others around, because he has all of this doom at his hands if he were to ever lose control of it, which seems to be something that is actually in danger of happening. So I want to take this time to talk a little bit about my opinion of romance in fiction, because we don't have any other couples in the story, so I'm going to use these two. So I think that romance in fiction, if executed well, is incredibly interesting. However, I have a lot of things that will immediately turn me off to a romance, and so almost nothing meets my ridiculously high standards. I think that relationships between two people are very interesting, and I like analyzing them, but I have this weird allergy to passionate displays of emotion. You know, if people are crying in the rain, telling each other they love each other, I'm immediately stop caring about everything that has happened so far. So Wildbow at one point said that he thinks that relationships with power imbalances in them are more interesting to him personally, and that's why so many of his relationships that he writes have those. In this case, Matthew shaped Edith, and therefore she has potentially some amount of feeling of debt to him, or obligation, even if he's not doing so on purpose. And some people have had issue with this in the past. And I really tried not to think about this whole power imbalance thing when I was reading Pale, because I want to see it as this piece of fiction, this story, without having to think about the stuff outside of the story that might be affecting it, but I couldn't, unfortunately. So I want to give my opinion on power imbalances in relationships. Obviously, I think it is best when both partners are striving to be equal and treat each other well and aren't exploiting each other. But I think that relationships without any kind of power imbalance just plain don't exist, or if they do, they're very rare. For example, a couple may be together for 15 years, and then one of them suffers a terrible car accident and is paralyzed from the waist down. Now one of them has to take care of the other for a very long time until they have their new patterns and habits fleshed out. And in that situation, the partner who isn't injured is in a position of power over the other. And it doesn't mean that there's anything bad or toxic going on, but it does mean that there is an imbalance in power, and it's not necessarily bad. Another example. Within a couple, it's very, very unlikely that they make the exact same amount of money. And maybe that doesn't bother most people, but each couple probably has to find a way to reconcile the fact that one of them makes more money than the other emotionally. And it's a fact of life. It's just something that comes up that is an imbalance between two people. But that doesn't mean the relationship is flawed. It just means that one of them makes more money. Relationships ebb and flow. Different situations come up and are resolved during the course of every relationship, unless it's very, very short. The problem is when the power imbalance is being exploited. In the case of Matthew and Edith, there is some concern that Matthew shaped Edith, and this is influencing her decision to stay with him or be around him, particularly because Avery seems to pick up on something weird going on. Yes, there is a power imbalance between them. Is this the source of the discomfort? I'm not sure. What I'm saying is, not necessarily. Is there something funky going on? Probably. It's been brought up a couple of times. But Matthew seems, for lack of a better word, stoked that he's married to Edith. He's always checking with her about everything. He's excited to see her when they've been apart. And he asks permission to kiss Louise to take away her memory in the first chapter of the story. We haven't seen anything strange on Matthew's front. And when he asks Edith whether she loves him, she says yes. It's possible that Edith is not voicing some kind of concern that she has. But we haven't seen any evidence that this particular aspect of the relationship is a problem. Now, of course, there is the whole Matthew can take away people's memories, and is he controlling Edith in any way? Sure, theoretically it's possible. I don't see it. Yeah. We do see a lot of instances of Edith being more comfortable the farther away they get from civilization, and the girls are wondering whether the discomfort they picked up on in her is actually just a symptom of the fact that she's uncomfortable around town. I think there's probably more to it than that, since it's been brought up this many times, but I don't think it is what they think it is. Anyway, I feel like I should bring this up now. What do I think makes a good fictional relationship? So I made a list, and this isn't comprehensive, but I've brought this up before if you've seen me talk elsewhere about what I think about relationships. The questions I ask are, do they positively impact each other's plot lines? Now, this is only applicable in large cast series where the two people in the relationship aren't the main characters, but do these people impact what the other is doing? Otherwise, they're just two people shoved together for no reason. And maybe they do impact each other negatively, but eventually it has to be positive. Do they help each other with a struggle that they previously had? So this doesn't necessarily relate to the plot, but let's say, but if one person is lonely and looking for a relationship, why are they lonely and looking for a relationship, and does this person meet that reason? Does this person help them with that? And also, does it reciprocate? Does the first person help the other in an emotional way? Third, do they have things in common that are not shared with the majority of the rest of the cast? And it doesn't even have to be in common. They could have a dichotomy that is completely opposed, but isn't thematically reflected in the rest of the cast. But there has to be a reason why they're with this person and not anybody else. Finally, do I see this romance expressed in creative ways? If you've ever seen Attack of the Clones, that's the boringest love story ever. It's just a series of scenes that are designed to check off a little box. We did it. We wrote a romance. First they have a conversation, then they go frolicking in a field. Then they have this scene where Anakin opens up to Padme about the fact that he killed a bunch of aliens. Can't believe I just forgot the name of that species, but I'm just gonna roll right through it. And finally they admit that they love each other. And it's so by the book. Absolutely nothing creative was done here. Okay, maybe not nothing, but like, it's nothing that I thought I hadn't seen before. Now, there are not a lot of romances that actually meet this standard because it's a really rigorous standard, but, and it doesn't even account for things like, are they exploiting each other? Are they not, do they not have an uncomfortable age difference or whatever? But one of the very few romances that actually did meet this standard that I've come across was written by Wildbow, so I have faith in his ability to write healthy romances, even if not all of the romances he writes are healthy. Finally, I have this weird automatic reaction to characters with certain qualities. Anytime you get a character who is like permanently possessed with another creature or essence or something, I automatically like them more. No reason. And then secondly, if any character has any kind of darkness or shadow themed ability, they're automatically either my favorite or very near the top. I have no idea why this is. It's always been that way. Previously, Wildbow has had a few characters in Parahumans who have darkness as a descriptor in front of their power. They automatically became one of my favorites right off the bat, and I can't tell you why. But for this reason, Matthew is one of my favorites. That's just how it is. Anyway, everything about Matthew and Edith is just a set of tropes that I am going to be very, very interested in. Finally, any kind of bond creatures, like creatures who are connected in some way magically, I eat that shit up. I love it. Basically, Matthew and Edith are a collection of tropes that I find really, really interesting, and Wildbow has created a lot of interesting characters, and eventually he was going to get to some character concept that embodies a bunch of things that just flip my interesting switches. And this is probably the closest. So every time they come on screen, I automatically hear that little Starship Troopers, would you like to know more soundbite? Yeah. Okay, so my next favorite, John Styles. He insists that he's not a super soldier, but I think he's pretty super. Also, I've always wanted to know what Master Chief's last name is, and now we finally have it. So, John is a dog of war, which means that he is an amalgam of a bunch of ghosts, echoes of soldiers who have died. And this gives him several abilities to do things like find weapons, use weapons. He has a personality that's an amalgam of a bunch of soldiers from a few countries. So he comes across a little bit as a stereotype, but that's just kind of his nature. I've complained before on this channel about characters who live forever being portrayed as evil. This was brought up a little bit in relation to John. He has found patterns that comfort him. He plays video games, reads and stuff, and plays music as a way that he says to while away the time, but also sort of train himself to be in a mindset that he can handle. But some of the goblins have mentioned that he could eventually lose it over time. He's just not quite that old yet. He guards the town. If he ever gets seriously injured or almost killed, he will show up again a few days later. There was another dog dog being his species, whom he loved or came as close to loving as he can, named Yalda, whom he had to kill for an unknown reason. Not sure. But apparently she was a similar spirit made up of like casualties of war, women and children and old people all mushed together. And whoever kills her takes on a curse. And he carried that curse for a while. And because of this, he was selected to be the next Carmine Beast if something were to happen to the Carmine Beast. And there's definitely more to this story. There has to be. We know that this was less than 15 and more than 6 years ago. But soon after this, John becomes one of the girls' most reliable allies. He gives them each a dog tag that can summon him to their aid if needed, and he does actually come to help them if they need him. There's this OVA of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood called Simple People, and it's about these two characters who aren't really concerned with climbing the social or political ladder or making any sweeping changes. They just want to be good at their jobs, live a happy life, and fulfill their smaller goals. And every time John comes on screen, on page, I think about that episode because he just wants to fulfill his smaller goals, protect the town, and lead a life that makes him as close to happy as he can reasonably be. Because of this simplicity to his psychology, he doesn't want to be the Carmine Beast. And because he doesn't want to, he's in this position of vulnerability within the story. Everybody knows that he is supposed to take this role, so everybody's maneuvering around the fact that he will take it, even if they know that what they're doing will put him in danger. Associated with John are the Goblins. They run a business helping practitioners learn how to deal with goblins, particularly young practitioners. They're led by Toad Swallow. These goblins seem almost hilariously trustworthy for the amount of bad that they do. They make other dogs and stuff, but they also seem to genuinely connect with the girls. They think that the girls are neat. Toad Swallow is the first person who ever regards Lucy with the amount of respect that she wants. That's not the right phrasing, but he regards her as intimidating, which is what she's been trying to be seen as to some people. And he respects her abilities as a practitioner and goes away when she wants to be left alone. And because of this, they have a role in the story similar to John. They're allies to the girls and they're open up front with them, even if they have ill intentions. So next is the Hungry Choir. The Hungry Choir is honestly worth a lot more exploration and discussion than the 5 minutes that I've talked about them, but they are one of the most interesting concepts I've ever seen in a book. So they are what's called a living ritual. So some people at some point started doing some ritual, and it took on magical qualities, and now it perpetuates itself. All of the people that you see, hundreds of children, but there are some adults, are people who have been lost to this ritual. And the ritual itself is, there's a website, you can go sign up to do the ritual if you want to. If you do, 8 times a moon cycle, you go along with 7 other people or up to 7 other people, to fight an animal. And while you are fighting this animal, you have to sing the lyrics to this weird and creepy song. And by the end of the song, you have to have eaten a part of the animal. So the one that we see, they are fighting a bull, and everybody has to eat part of this bull. If you miss a verse or your line, then the children of the choir will come after you and punish you until you catch up. If you do not eat a part of the animal, or you fail in general, you become part of the choir. Yeah. Yeah, it's screwed up. There's no two ways about it. Oh yeah, and then the final night of whoever's final night it is, so your 8th time that you do it is your final night. You have to eat 7 body parts from each of the other 7 participants. Who the hell came up with this? Somebody had to have come up with it. And we're going to talk about this later, but like, it's not as old as you would think it is, because they're using the internet. It's all done through a computer. Somebody came up with this in the last 30 years. And people are doing it. And then whoever wins, you don't have to worry about buying food for the rest of your life. You can't starve, and you get infinite money as long as you spend it on food and drugs. Whoop-de-frickin-do. I mean, we did see some examples of people who would genuinely benefit from this. But for the most part, I'm like, why did you sign up for this? This is stupid. Especially the several hundred people who are in the choir. Like, how are there that many people with the sufficient specific health problems to decide that this was a good idea? The answer, of course, is that the majority of the people who fell for it were kids. Speaking of which, we see this through the eyes of Gabe, a boy who is in the girls' class, who is aspiring to be an actor. And he thinks that not having to worry about money for food would take away one of his concerns that would be beneficial for the rest of his life. So he signs up for this. And you understand how somebody could come to the conclusion that this might be appealing. But you are also really frustrated with Gabe, because even though it is appealing, actually doing it is really dumb. It's really dumb. But yeah, all of the people who are in the choir, or at least most of them, are kids like Gabe, who don't really have the decision-making faculties to take on this responsibility. And I know I went on this long rant last week about respect for children, and I do believe in it, but I do believe that an 8th grade boy would make this decision. And so 8th grade boys should not be allowed to make this decision. So then there's Alpiana. So Alpiana is a mare, short for nightmare, and she distributes nightmares to the town. She's like the Tooth Fairy, but she delivers nightmares. And she appears as this person with really filthy hair and clothes, and when she appears over your bed, she like vomits black goo all over you and stuff. You have a nightmare, and then the black goo disappears and she goes on to the next house. And the nightmares that she gives are supposed to make people think about their lives and make them better in some way. One of the people that she visits most frequently, for example, is an old man who abused his wife and children until she left and took the kids. And these nightmares are supposed to make him realize that he was bad before he dies. She also intends to visit Verona's father, who is a dickwagon. And I've seen some complaints that this is a bit too much punitive justice and not enough rehabilitative justice. And I'm gonna have to give a soft disagree. Now, I want to preface this with, we haven't actually seen what these nightmares are like. We haven't seen what a person acts like after they've been visited by Alpiana. We don't know if people actually improve over time with frequent visits by this nightmare. But I don't think that this is necessarily, out of hand, a bad thing. Because the thing is, even in countries where their rehabilitative justice program is perfect and the punishment is as minimal as it can get, it's never fun. It is always unpleasant. The person who committed a crime is still plagued by feelings of guilt and realization that they were wrong to do what they did. And that's the outcome that we hope for. Not because we want them to feel bad, but because we don't want them to do it again. We want them to think that they made the wrong choice. And inherently, that feeling isn't fun. And I don't think that it's fair to say that Alpiana's job is unjust just because she doesn't say bippity boppity boop and make people better. She's leading them towards the opportunity to choose to be better. If she forced spirits of goodness onto people, it wouldn't be their choice. Imagine if she magically made Robert Hayward a better father. That would be awesome. That would especially be awesome for Verona. But would it be real development? No. It wouldn't. Finally, and again, I want to say, we haven't actually seen what these look like from the perspective of somebody who is receiving a nightmare or has just gotten out of a nightmare or anything like that. We don't know what this really does. So there's not enough to make a real decision here. Avery and Verona both want Alpiana as their familiar. Alpiana just wants to be somebody's familiar. This basically has to cause some drama at some point. And then there's Marisica. So I brought this up on that episode of Pale Reflections, so I'm sorry if I'm being a little bit redundant for those of you who have listened to or will listen to the other one, but Marisica is the person that made me realize that the others in town are acting as some kind of parents to the girls. Marisica is absolutely trying to influence the way that the girls practice. And if the girls are supposed to continue to practice in the town for the rest of their lives, the others are absolutely incentivized to influence the girls to behave the way that they want them to behave and be the kind of practitioners that they want them to be. She gives Verona the ability to change her shape. She turns into a cat and a mink. She also tells her that fairy, potentially, are human children packed with glamour. Verona, the one that wants to not be a human children anymore. She keeps Lucy away just long enough to get her into trouble with her mother, which could be over, but maybe isn't. But most importantly, she does a whole lot with Avery. And, for example, I don't believe what she's trying to say about the three girls that could be in a relationship with Avery at some point. What she specifically says is there are three girls in Kennet who could be interested in you, but all of those would go badly. All of those relationships would go badly. And she explains how each of them would go badly. And my first reaction to reading this was, okay, well, I think what it is that there's a fourth girl who could actually be in a happy relationship with Avery. But now what Marisica is trying to get her to do is reject that fourth girl that could be in a successful relationship with her so that Avery is more separated from humanity and more drawn to magic. But after I read the chapter, every single person I talked to had a completely different interpretation for what way Marisica might be trying to screw Avery over. So it could be anything. But the fact is, the final outcome of the scheme with Pam was that Avery became a more careful person, a person who realized that she's manipulable, and a person who realizes that she needs to pay more attention when dealing with unfamiliar others from now on. Which is good. The thing about Marisica and fairies in general is that she's playing 7-dimensional chess when everybody else maxes out at 3 dimensions. So any plans that Marisica has for the girls basically trump whatever other plans anybody else is trying to use on them, which can be to their advantage if the fairies are good. But every single person in town has told them, stay away from the fairies. They're evil. Hilariously, I do want to bring up that in the bonus material Notes on Others 1, we see that Avery thinks that Avery's immediate instinct is that Alpiana looks suspicious and Maricica seems kind and trustworthy, and Verona thinks the exact opposite. This is interesting. For one, I think that Avery's ability to judge other people is crap. For two, I think we were explicitly contrasting Avery and Verona there. Then there's Guillerme. Unfortunately, I don't have too much to say about Guillerme right now. He is a fairy, but he is slightly less suspicious than Maricica, just because Maricica is like as suspicious as anybody gets. He is tolerated by John, and then he leans into his friendship with John to try to be trusted by other people. It's, I can think of some people in real life who use this strategy, but he doesn't seem to be trusted by anybody, even though he claims that being John's friend makes him trustworthy. But it does give some points to John that he thinks that being associated with John makes him look better. I'm not going to cover the people from the Blue Heron Institute right now because we've barely seen anything of them. So I'm going to do a bit more of an analysis on them when we see more about who they are as individuals other than Nicolette. So overall, how do the others treat the girls? John and Alpiana especially seem to treat them as equals. They respect their intellect and don't treat them as kids. Now, these creatures are so much older than the girls that there's no difference between a human adult and these girls to them, which probably has to do with with why the Hungry Choir goes after children so explicitly. The goblins act a bit as their older siblings. Some of them treat them as equals, but for the most part, they act like they're just a little bit more knowledgeable than the girls are. Edith and Matthew seem to be acting as sort of their aunts and uncles. They have a much more we're adults and you're kids mentality, which is influenced by the fact that Matthew is mostly human, has a human lifespan, I think. And Edith spends all her time around Matthew. And then there's Miss. Miss kind of swings back and forth between being a genuine friend to them and mentor and Mother Gothel figure. But I don't think she's as bad as Mother Gothel. Personally, I think at the end of this we're going to love Miss dearly. But she doesn't always do things for them which are necessarily in their absolute best interest. She gives them gifts that do put them in danger. And while I think that she has their best interests at heart, as far as by giving Avery the opportunity to become a finder, she's giving Avery a purpose, but it also is a bit of a ship is safe in harbor situation. Avery can't be safe and do the practice. Finally, about Miss, Verona trusts her. Miss is the only person who knows that Verona doesn't intend to be human at the end of this. And she doesn't say anything to encourage or discourage her, but I do kind of get the sense that she is encouraging her. Maricica notes that the three girls were chosen because they are closer to being others than the rest of the girls in the town, or on average than the rest of the girls in the town. Where this is going, no idea. No idea. No idea. So finally, I want to go over some recurring motifs and themes about this story in general. So we've got a lot of amalgam creatures, so creatures that are made up of multiple ghosts or echoes or whatever. That's John, Yalda, Edith, the Hungry Choir, and I think that this theme comes from the fact that our protagonists are 3 girls. Instead of having one protagonist, we've got 3 who operate as a unit and interact and switch perspective. That's kind of scary in that I don't want them to become some mushed up creature at the end of this, but I do think that that's the source of that theme that we're seeing. And then we've got this theme of memory loss and lostness in general. Gabriel is completely forgotten by his family and friends after he loses the Hungry Choir game. Louise loses her memory after her deal with Matthew, and Miss has something to do with memory. I didn't understand that statement. She was a memory without anyone to have it, or a person forgotten even by the abyss, or an echo forgotten even by the ruins. Whatever the hell that means. And there's kind of an additional component of lostness in there. You know, what does it mean to have lost something? I would say that this is a theme that surrounds Finders and Miss specifically, but because we have it in the Hungry Choir, I think that it's a bit more pervasive. There's also the loss of the Carmine Beast and anybody's care about who she was. Her as a person or as a creature has been largely forgotten, or at least nobody cares. And then we've got this theme of parents and child rearing, and whether you have a free-range kid that's raised by the village. The 3 girls are so much more free-range than I was, and more than most of the other kids I knew. Maybe it's because I lived in a small town where there was not a lot to do, but kids that I knew growing up went home at the end of the day and played video games, or participated in an after-school activity and then went home and played video games. We didn't have a whole lot of this, okay, I'm gonna go eat dinner at this other person's house, let me hop on my bike and leave. And it's probably a cultural difference, but these characters are more free range than the average child, I think. Let me know in the comments if you think that that's inaccurate, or if maybe I was just in a more sheltered community than most. I'm actually not sure about this one. Then you've got risk versus reward. This was particularly pervasive in the Blue Heron chapter from Nicolette's perspective, but also in the whole idea of being a practitioner. It's extremely risky to be a practitioner, but would I do it? Maybe this sounds dumb, but yeah. I want to do magic. And so does everybody else in this. You know, Gabe realizes that he could die, but he's like, you know what? No, I want to be part of this stupid ritual. Risk versus reward. Everyone being very cautious and defensive. Miss is like this, Lucy is like this, so is everybody else. Being afraid of the possibility of getting hurt. And it ties back into that risk versus reward thing. Do I want to put myself out there and risk being hurt, or do I want to stay safe at home and risk having a boring life? Verona kind of embodies this as well. She doesn't want to grow up and become insert boring job of your choice here. She'd rather take the risk and become a fairy or whatever she's going to end up doing. I hope it's something not being a fairy. I don't like fairies. Then you've got faces and presentation. The magic system in this, it incentivizes people to be dramatic and to present themselves in a way that is confident. Miss has no face. The girls' faces are seen by others as the animal motif that they use. I don't know where we're going with this, but this whole idea of how you present yourself is very important, particularly because we get a lot of beats about particularly Lucy and Verona's clothes during their normal lives. Lucy spends an awful lot of time dealing with her hair so that she looks the way she wants to look when presenting herself to others. Verona doesn't shop for new clothes because she wants to wear the clothes that she is most comfortable in and that she sees herself most in. Also, the girls wear specific clothing when they are doing magic. which ties back into this as well. And then we've got things are not as old as we think they are. So a lot of these creatures, at first we would think that they are like ancient creatures that have been around since the beginning of time, particularly if you've read Pact, which has impacted my expectations here. But a lot of these creatures are not actually as old as we think they are. Edith was put into Edith James's body within the last few years. John was created within the lifetime of your average human. He's probably about as old as he appears to be based on the timeline that we see. The Hungry Choir uses the internet to communicate and organize themselves, which is bizarre because the animals in the ritual seem at least related to, creatures from the Chinese zodiac or something. I did check the Chinese zodiac, it's not the same. But the choices seem like this is some ancient ritual that has persisted until today, but I don't think that it was. So things being newer than you originally anticipated is a recurring motif, I think. Also, at the beginning of the prologue, we think that Louise is probably an old woman, and then it turns out that she's 35 and she's just dying. So yeah. That's pretty much all I had for this week. I did want to bring up something though. I don't know if this is going to work or not. Pale Reflections, like I said, exists, and I don't want to be redundant to them. But I figured that I would provide some amount of audience engagement, because why not? It's fun. So originally this was supposed to be a podcast. This was supposed to be a thing that I produced only audio for, but instead I left the video component in and never brought it to a podcast. So instead of having a discussion question, instead of having written discussion answers, I'm going to ask a discussion question, and I'm going to ask that you submit your answer in the form of a picture. It could be a meme, it can be a whiteboard drawing, it can be a beautiful painting, but just submit whatever and I'll put it up in the video. I think it'll be fun, and I will participate, of course. So you have 2 weeks for this one. We're gonna start out with something simple because I don't know whether this is gonna work, and I think that probably a lot of people are going to not want to participate, but draw who you think killed the Carmine Beast, or how you think it died, in as much detail as you can communicate in your MS Paint drawing or whatever you'd like to submit. So, yeah, I hope this works. I think it'll be fun. That's all I had for this week. See you at the next one.